This is the question I keep hearing, in different forms, from different people, with different levels of alarm underneath it. Why hasn't it collapsed yet? Sometimes it's asked with genuine curiosity, sometimes with frustration, from people who've been expecting a reckoning for years and keep watching it not arrive. Sometimes with a kind of anxious hope that maybe the answer is because it won't, that maybe the dire analysis is simply wrong and the resilience we keep observing is evidence of genuine underlying strength. I want to answer this question honestly, not with false comfort, not with performative alarm, but with the same kind of careful, mechanistic thinking I've tried to apply to every economic question I've taken seriously throughout my career. Because the honest answer is not simple. It's not the economy is fine. It's not collapse is imminent. It's something more nuanced and I think more important than either of those easy answers. The US economy has not collapsed yet because collapse is not how economies break. Economies don't fall off cliffs. They erode. They develop fractures that spread slowly, that interact with each other in ways that aren't immediately visible, that are individually manageable, until suddenly, not gradually, they are not. And understanding the difference between an economy that is eroding toward a breaking point and an economy that is simply experiencing cyclical stress is, in my view, the most important analytical task for any serious investor or household right now. Let me show you how I think about this. And let me be honest with you about what the evidence actually shows. The first thing I want to establish is why economies are so much more resilient than most crisis predictions account for. Because I think this resilience is real, it's structural, and it's important to understand correctly rather than either dismiss or misinterpret. Modern economies are extraordinarily complex adaptive systems. They contain millions of actors, households, businesses, financial institutions, governments, each of whom is continuously responding to changing conditions and adjusting their behavior. This adaptive quality is one of the most powerful features of a market economy. When one part of the system comes under stress, other parts adjust. Prices change. Behavior changes, capital moves, the system finds a new equilibrium. This adaptive capacity is why economic forecasts of collapse are almost always wrong about timing. The system keeps finding ways to absorb stress that the forecasters didn't anticipate. The Federal Reserve intervenes. Fiscal policy provides stimulus. Private actors restructure their positions. International capital flows fill gaps. Again and again, a crisis that seemed imminent gets absorbed or deferred. But, and this is the crucial point, adaptive resilience is not the same as structural soundness. An economy can be highly adaptive and simultaneously be accumulating structural imbalances that will eventually, not cyclically but structurally, demand resolution. The distinction matters enormously for how you interpret what you're observing right now. When you see the US economy continuing to function, markets open, businesses operating, households spending, despite what appear to be serious structural pressures, there are two possible interpretations. The first is that the apparent pressures are less serious than they seem, that the resilience reflects genuine underlying strength and the alarm is simply misplaced. The second is that the adaptive mechanisms are absorbing the stress, but in ways that are themselves adding to the structural imbalances, that the short-term functioning is being purchased at the cost of making the long-term resolution more difficult. These two interpretations lead to very different conclusions about how to position for what comes next. And the way to distinguish between them is not to look at whether the economy is currently functioning. It's to look at the mechanisms by which it is functioning and whether those mechanisms are sustainable. Let me describe what I see when I look at the structural condition of the US economy right now. Not the cyclical picture, but the structural one. The most fundamental structural feature of the current US economy is that it is, at every layer, a debt-based system, by which I mean the functioning of the economy at every level, household, corporate, financial, governmental, depends on the continuous availability of credit at affordable rates. Remove that availability or make it significantly more expensive and the entire system contracts, not just the financial sector. Everything? Because every layer of the economy is leveraged against the layer below it, and every layer of the economy depends on credit to function at its current level of activity. This is not unique to the current moment. The US economy has been credit dependent for decades, but the degree of that dependency, and therefore the economy's sensitivity to changes in credit availability and cost, has grown significantly over time. And critically, the cost of that credit, the interest rate environment in which the debt was accumulated, has changed in ways that are now working their way through the system. When debt is accumulated in an era of low interest rates and then the rate environment changes significantly, the stress is not immediate. It is gradual. Existing fixed-rate debt continues to be serviced at the old rate. But as debt matures and needs to be refinanced, the new rate environment is locked in. The stress accumulates not all at once, but systematically, as each maturing loan, each refinanced mortgage, each rolled-over corporate credit facility gets repriced to the current environment. This is the process currently underway. It is not dramatic. It does not produce the sudden, visible crisis that most collapse predictions envision. It produces a slow, steady increase in the cost of debt service across every layer of the economy, household, corporate, financial, governmental, that gradually reduces the financial flexibility available at each layer and gradually increases the fragility of the system. The specific form this takes at each layer is worth examining separately because the layers interact and the interaction is where the systemic risk lives. Let me walk through the specific layers of the debt-based system and describe what the accumulated stress looks like at each level. At the household level, the primary mechanism is the interaction between accumulated consumer debt and elevated interest rates. American households, in aggregate, carry significant debt: mortgage debt, auto debt, student debt, credit card debt. For most of the past decade and a half, the cost of carrying that debt was artificially suppressed by the extraordinary monetary policy environment. As rates have normalized, the cost of variable rate debt has increased, and the cost of fixed rate debt increases incrementally as existing obligations mature and are refinanced. This creates a gradual reduction in household disposable income, not a sudden crisis, but a persistent compounding squeeze on the financial flexibility available to ordinary households. At the corporate level, the stress is most visible in the private credit market, the shadow banking system that expanded dramatically during the era of cheap money, funding itself from pension funds and retirement accounts and lending it to businesses that couldn't access traditional bank credit. This system worked extremely well when rates were low and credit conditions were loose. It faces genuine structural stress in an environment of higher rates and tightening credit conditions because the loans it made were underwritten against assumptions that no longer hold, and because the investors who funded it are now seeking liquidity that the illiquid nature of the underlying assets cannot easily provide. This is not a small problem contained in an obscure corner of finance. The private credit market has grown to a size that makes it systemically significant. The businesses that borrowed from it, small and medium enterprises, real estate developers, leveraged buyout targets, represent a significant portion of the real economy's employment and output. If credit conditions tighten enough to force a meaningful wave of defaults or restructurings in this market, the effects on employment and economic activity would be substantial. At the sovereign level, the structural pressure is most fundamental and most consequential in the long run. The US government's fiscal position, the relationship between its revenues and its obligations, has reached a condition where the math is genuinely concerning, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum. The core of the problem is not simply the total level of debt, though that is large. It is the interaction between three forces: the level and growth rate of mandatory spending commitments, the obligations to an aging population that were made decades ago and that cannot easily be reduced without dramatic economic and political consequences, the level and growth rate of interest expense, which is rising as old debt matures and is refinanced at higher rates, and the revenue base, which is itself dependent on a level of economic activity and asset prices that are subject to the pressures I've been describing. When you add those three forces together, mandatory commitments, rising interest expense, revenue base under pressure, what you get is a fiscal arithmetic that has very few comfortable solutions. The uncomfortable solutions, allowing inflation to erode the real value of the debt, monetizing the debt through central bank asset purchases, some form of financial repression that keeps rates artificially below the market level, all have significant economic costs, but they may increasingly be the only available options. I want to spend time on the specific current catalyst that is most immediately threatening to add energy to the structural pressures I've described. An oil supply disruption, of the kind that results from a closure or significant reduction in flow through any of the world's major energy choke points, is not simply a commodity market event. It is, because of oil's role as the foundational input cost for almost every sector of the economy, an economy-wide cost shock. When oil prices rise significantly and sustainably, the costs rise across transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and every supply chain that depends on any of those sectors. Those rising costs squeeze corporate margins, reduce consumer purchasing power, and create inflationary pressure that the Federal Reserve cannot simply ignore. But the Federal Reserve's tools for addressing inflation, primarily raising interest rates, are not well suited to cost-push inflation driven by a supply shock. Raising rates reduces demand. It does not produce more oil. It does not resolve the supply disruption. What it does is slow the economy, adding economic contraction to the inflationary pressure rather than relieving the inflation. This is the specific trap that energy-driven inflation creates. The normal policy response to inflation makes the economic situation worse without fully addressing the inflation. The Federal Reserve faces a genuine dilemma between allowing inflation to persist, which erodes purchasing power and undermines confidence in price stability, and applying the tools to combat it, which adds recessionary pressure to an economy already under the structural stresses I've described. This dilemma is not hypothetical. It has been the defining feature of every major oil shock in the post-war era. And in each of those episodes, the interaction between energy cost pressure and the policy response to it was the proximate catalyst for the economic downturns that followed. The current situation has a specific feature that makes it more challenging than most historical analogies suggest: the pre-existing structural pressures I've described. In previous oil shocks, the economy entered the stress from a stronger fiscal and financial position. The policy space available, the room to cut rates, to expand fiscal stimulus, to absorb the shock through public and private balance sheet expansion, was significantly greater than it is now. The same oil shock that produced a manageable recession in a less leveraged, less fiscally stressed economy can produce a much more severe contraction in an economy that is already carrying the structural load I've been describing. Now let me turn to why the economy hasn't collapsed yet, the actual mechanisms by which the structural pressures have been absorbed so far, because this is where I think the analysis gets genuinely interesting. The US economy and the US government have access to several powerful adaptive mechanisms that have repeatedly prevented the structural pressures from translating into acute crisis. Understanding these mechanisms and understanding their limits is essential to forming a realistic view of where we are in the arc of the current stress. The first escape valve is the Federal Reserve's balance sheet capacity. The Fed has demonstrated, most dramatically in 2008-2009 and again in 2020, that it is willing and able to expand its balance sheet dramatically to absorb financial system stress and prevent acute crisis from becoming systemic collapse. This capacity is real. It has worked, and the knowledge that it exists is itself a stabilizing force. It prevents the kind of self-fulfilling panics that characterized pre-central bank crises. But it has limits. The primary limit is inflation. Expanding the Fed's balance sheet in an environment of already elevated inflation and energy-driven cost pressure is a different proposition from expanding it in an environment of deflationary collapse, as in 2008, or genuine demand destruction, as in the COVID shock. The capacity exists, but the cost of using it is higher than it has been in previous applications, and the political and institutional constraints on its use are correspondingly greater. The second escape valve is the dollar's reserve currency status. Because the world needs dollars to conduct international trade and to hold as reserve assets, the US has access to a degree of fiscal flexibility that no other country possesses. It can borrow in its own currency at rates that are sustained by global reserve demand, even in the face of fiscal imbalances that would produce a currency crisis in any other country. This is the exorbitant privilege that has funded American fiscal deficits for decades, but this mechanism also has limits. The reserve currency status is sustained by confidence, by the world's belief that dollar-denominated assets are the safest and most reliable store of value available. As I've discussed in previous videos, that confidence is under more serious challenge than at any point in recent memory. The limit is not imminent, but it is real. And each additional stress on the US fiscal and monetary position is another increment of erosion in the confidence that sustains the mechanism. The third escape valve is political adaptability. American political institutions, for all their current dysfunction, have historically been capable of genuine adaptation when the pressure became acute enough. The fiscal adjustments of the 1990s, the extraordinary monetary and fiscal policy responses of 2008, 2009, and 2020. The capacity for political adaptation is real and should not be underestimated. But political adaptation operates on a timeline and under constraints that are different from the timeline of economic pressure. The political system may eventually adapt, but the adaptation is unlikely to be smooth or timely enough to prevent the structural pressures from translating into significant economic disruption along the way. Let me bring this together into the practical framework I think is most useful for navigating the current moment. The answer to the question, why hasn't it collapsed yet, is because the escape valves are still functioning. The adaptive mechanisms I've described, the Federal Reserve's capacity, the reserve currency status, the political system's adaptability, are still absorbing the structural pressures before they translate into acute crisis. But the question that actually matters for your financial position is not, will it collapse? Because that framing misses how economic deterioration actually works. The question is, in what direction is the economy moving structurally, and how does my current positioning align with that direction? The structural direction I see is toward tighter credit conditions, higher debt service costs, reduced fiscal flexibility, persistent inflationary pressure from energy and supply chain disruption, and a gradual erosion of the specific monetary privileges that have allowed the US to absorb its imbalances with less immediate consequence than any other economy would face. That direction has specific implications for asset classes, for sectors, and for household financial planning. It implies that assets whose value is most dependent on the continuation of abundant credit and low rates face ongoing headwinds. It implies that assets that are most independent of any particular monetary arrangement or most reflective of the fundamental productive capacity of the real economy are likely to be more resilient. It implies that liquidity, the ability to act when conditions become more extreme, has value that is not adequately reflected in most people's current positioning. And it implies that the comfortable assumption that the adaptive mechanisms will continue to absorb structural stress indefinitely is not a sound basis for financial planning. None of this requires predicting a specific crash on a specific date. It requires honestly assessing the structural direction and positioning for it before the direction becomes undeniable to everyone, at which point the most favorable adjustments will already have been made by those who saw it earlier. Before my closing thoughts, 3 brief things. First, I've put together a framework document that covers how I assess the structural health of an economy as distinct from its cyclical condition, the specific indicators I monitor, the mechanisms I watch, and the principles I use to translate structural analysis into positioning decisions. It's in the description, completely free. Second, if you want to go deeper on this, on building the kind of serious structural framework for understanding economic conditions that holds up under genuine uncertainty, I've built a community of thoughtful, long-horizon investors around exactly that kind of work. Details are in the description. Third, if this kind of honest, careful analysis is useful to you, subscribe. The structural story I've been describing is going to keep developing. I intend to keep tracking it clearly. Let me close with the most honest version of the answer to the question this video started with. Why has the US economy not collapsed yet? Because collapse is the wrong frame. Economic systems don't collapse in the way that frame implies, suddenly, completely, dramatically. They erode. They accumulate stress across multiple layers simultaneously. They absorb that stress through adaptive mechanisms that are real but that have costs and limits. And they eventually reach a point where the accumulated stress exceeds the capacity of the adaptive mechanisms to absorb it, at which point the resolution is not a sudden collapse but a painful, extended adjustment that is more severe than it would have been if the imbalances had been addressed earlier. The US economy is not at that point yet. The escape valves are still functioning. The adaptive mechanisms are still working. The structural pressures have not yet overwhelmed the system's capacity to absorb them. But the structural pressures are real. They are accumulating. The mechanisms absorbing them are not without limits. And the specific combination of fiscal stress, credit market fragility, energy disruption, and eroding monetary privilege that characterizes the current moment is historically associated with outcomes that are significantly worse than the current market pricing suggests. Understanding that calmly, clearly, without panic or denial, is the foundation of making intelligent financial decisions in the current environment. The economy hasn't collapsed yet. That doesn't mean it's fine. I'll see you in the next one.